It was a Wednesday afternoon in late April, and across the state of Alabama, the sky had been dark and heavy for hours. The air felt thick and wet, the kind of air that clings to your skin and makes you feel like you are breathing through a damp cloth. People had been watching the weather since early morning because the National Weather Service had warned about a dangerous outbreak of storms. But by the middle of the afternoon, the warnings had become more urgent. The storms that were forming were not ordinary thunderstorms. They were supercells, rotating monsters that could produce the worst kind of tornadoes. In the city of Tuscaloosa, home of the University of Alabama, the day had started like any other spring day. Students walked between classes, people worked in offices, children played in schoolyards, and shopkeepers prepared for the evening rush. The sky was gray, but that was not unusual for April in the South. Many people did not pay much attention to the clouds. They had heard the warnings, but warnings had come before and nothing had happened. So life went on. In the early afternoon, the National Weather Service in Birmingham issued a tornado watch for much of Alabama. That meant conditions were favorable for tornadoes to form. By 2:30 p.m., a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for parts of central Alabama. Then, just before 3:00 p.m., a tornado warning was issued for Greene and Hale counties, which are west of Tuscaloosa. This storm was moving fast, traveling northeast at about 45 miles per hour. It was a classic supercell, a powerful rotating thunderstorm that was already showing signs of producing a tornado. At 3:42 p.m., the first tornado touched down near the town of New Bern in Hale County. It was not a small tornado. It quickly grew in size and strength. Within minutes, it was a wedge tornado, meaning it was wider than it was tall, and it was on the ground. It tore through rural areas, destroying homes and trees, but the worst was yet to come. The supercell continued to move northeast, picking up energy from the warm, moist air coming from the Gulf of Mexico. It was a perfect setup for a violent tornado. The wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height was extreme. The storm was becoming a monster. By 4:30 p.m., the tornado warning was extended to include the city of Tuscaloosa. The storm was now heading directly toward the city, and it was intensifying. Sirens began to sound across the city. Some people heard them and took cover, others did not. Some thought it was just a drill, or they did not believe the tornado would actually hit the city. Tornadoes in Tuscaloosa were rare. The last major tornado had been decades ago. Many people simply did not have the experience to know what the sirens really meant. At 4:43 p.m., the tornado crossed the Black Warrior River and entered the city of Tuscaloosa. It was now a massive wedge tornado, more than half a mile wide. Its winds were estimated to be between 190 and 210 miles per hour, making it an EF4 tornado on the enhanced Fujita scale. That is only one step below the most powerful category of tornado, an EF5. The tornado was not just wide, it was also moving fast, about 50 miles per hour. It was a brick wall of wind and debris moving through a city of nearly 100,000 people. The tornado first struck the western edge of Tuscaloosa, a neighborhood called Forest Lake. Homes were flattened in seconds, trees were snapped like twigs or uprooted completely. Cars were tossed into the air and crushed. People who had taken shelter in their basements or interior bathrooms could hear the roar. It sounded like a freight train, only louder, deeper, more terrifying. The ground shook. The pressure in the air changed, making ears pop. Then the noise passed, and the silence that followed was even worse. The tornado then plowed into the Alberta City neighborhood, a dense area of apartments, houses, and businesses. This was a heavily populated area, and many students lived there because it was close to the university. The tornado did not slow down. It ripped through apartment complexes, tearing roofs off buildings, collapsing walls, and scattering debris across the streets. In some places, entire buildings were reduced to piles of rubble. In others, only the concrete slab of the foundation remained. The tornado was so powerful that it ripped the pavement off the roads and stripped bark from trees. At the same time, the tornado was moving into the central part of Tuscaloosa. It crossed 15th Street, one of the city's main roads where there were shopping centers, restaurants, and gas stations. The windows of a large grocery store were blown out and the roof collapsed. A gas station was destroyed and the underground tanks were ripped out of the ground. Cars were thrown into buildings. People who had been driving on 15th Street when the tornado hit had no time to find shelter. Some abandoned their cars and ran into nearby stores, but many cars were simply picked up and tossed like toys. The tornado then crossed the campus of the University of Alabama. The university had about 30,000 students. When the sirens sounded, many students and faculty took shelter in the basements of buildings or in interior hallways. Classes were canceled early that day because of the storms, so fewer people were on campus than usual. But still, the tornado passed dangerously close to several dorms and academic buildings. It destroyed several fraternity houses and apartment complexes near the campus. It also hit the university's medical center and other facilities. Remarkably, no one on campus was killed, but there were many injuries and widespread damage. After passing through the university area, the tornado continued northeast into the residential neighborhoods of the eastern part of Tuscaloosa. It destroyed hundreds of homes, many of them historic houses that had stood for more than a century. The tornado also struck a shopping mall, tearing off the roof and collapsing part of the building. A large section of the mall was completely destroyed. In less than 10 minutes, the tornado had carved a path of destruction through the heart of Tuscaloosa. It had killed dozens of people and injured hundreds more. But the tornado was not finished. It left Tuscaloosa and continued moving northeast along Interstate 2059. It was still a powerful wedge tornado, still moving at about 50 miles per hour. The storm was now heading toward the city of Birmingham, the largest city in Alabama. Along the way, the tornado passed through several small towns and rural areas, destroying everything in its path. It crossed into Jefferson County, just west of Birmingham, and continued to grow. The tornado was now entering the suburbs of Birmingham. It hit the city of Pleasant Grove, a community of about 10,000 people. The tornado completely destroyed hundreds of homes in Pleasant Grove. It was such a powerful tornado that many houses were completely swept away, leaving only the foundation. Trees were debarked and stripped of leaves. Cars were wrapped around trees. In some areas, the tornado was so violent that it scoured the ground, removing topsoil and grass, leaving only bare dirt. The tornado then moved into the city of Hueytown, another suburb of Birmingham. It destroyed a large part of the downtown area, including several churches, schools, and businesses. It also hit a strip mall and a grocery store. People who had taken shelter in the grocery store survived, but the building was heavily damaged. In Hueytown, the tornado killed several people and injured many more. The tornado continued its path of destruction through the Birmingham suburbs of Concord and Forestdale. It destroyed homes, apartments, and industrial buildings. At this point, the tornado had been on the ground for nearly 40 miles. It was still a massive, violent tornado. But finally, after passing through the northern part of Birmingham, the tornado began to weaken. The supercell was losing energy as it reached the cooler air north of the city. The tornado finally lifted around 5:15 p.m., about 90 minutes after it first touched down. The total path of the tornado was about 80 miles long, though a lot of that path had been continuous. It was one of the longest and deadliest tornadoes in Alabama history. The tornado killed 64 people in Tuscaloosa and another 54 people in other parts of Alabama, mostly in Jefferson County. There were more than 1,000 people injured. The damage was catastrophic. More than 5,000 homes were destroyed or heavily damaged. Thousands of vehicles were destroyed. The estimated cost of the damage was about $2.4 billion. In the immediate aftermath, the scene was like a war zone. Rescue workers and volunteers searched through the rubble for survivors. The National Guard was deployed to help with search and rescue and to maintain order. People wandered through the destroyed neighborhoods looking for their families, their homes, their belongings. The power was out across a large part of the area. There was no water, no phone service, no internet. The only sounds were the sirens of emergency vehicles, the hum of generators, and the cries of people who had lost everything. In Tuscaloosa, the university canceled classes for the rest of the week. Many students volunteered to help with the cleanup. The city was in shock. It had taken only 10 minutes for the tornado to destroy a large part of the city that had taken decades to build. The storm had changed everything. As night fell on April 27, 2011, people in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham tried to make sense of what had happened. They did not yet know that this was only one part of a much larger outbreak. The same supercell that had produced the Tuscaloosa tornado had also produced other tornadoes further north. But that was not all. Across the deep south from Mississippi to Georgia, there had been dozens of other tornadoes that same day. The April 25-28, 2011 tornado outbreak was the largest and deadliest tornado outbreak in the United States since 1936. In total, 364 people were killed across 7 states. The Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado was the deadliest single tornado of that outbreak. But in the immediate hours after the storm, no one was thinking about statistics. They were thinking about survival, about the people they had lost, about the future. In Tuscaloosa, a curfew was imposed to prevent looting and to allow rescue crews to work. The skies were clear that night, a stark contrast to the darkness that had descended on the city. Stars were visible, but no one was looking at them. They were looking at the rubble, looking for signs of life. The days that followed were filled with stories of survival and loss. There were stories of people who had huddled in bathtubs, under mattresses, in closets, and survived. There were stories of people who had been trapped under debris for hours, some who called for help on their cell phones. There were stories of strangers helping strangers, digging through wreckage with their bare hands. There were also stories of people who did not survive, whose bodies were found in the ruins of their homes days later. One of the most harrowing stories came from a woman named Lauren Young. She lived in a small frame house in the Alberta City neighborhood of Tuscaloosa. She was in her house with her husband and their 2 young children when the tornado struck. They had no basement, so they went to the interior hallway and covered themselves with pillows and blankets. The tornado ripped the roof off their house and then the walls collapsed around them. They were buried under debris. Lauren could not move. She could hear her husband nearby, but she could not see him. She could hear her children crying. She began to pray. After what felt like hours, a neighbor came and started digging. The neighbor pulled Lauren out, then her husband, then the children. All four of them survived, but their house was gone. They had nothing left but the clothes they were wearing. There were many stories like that, stories of miraculous survival and devastating loss. In Tuscaloosa, a young man named Micah Brooks was driving home on 15th Street when the tornado hit. He could see it coming, a huge black cloud of debris. He abandoned his car and ran into a nearby laundromat. He and about a dozen other people huddled in the back of the laundromat. The tornado ripped the roof off the building, and the walls began to collapse. The people in the laundromat held on to each other, forming a human chain. The tornado passed, and they all survived. The building was destroyed, but everyone inside lived. In Birmingham, a woman named Marie Jones was at her home in the suburbs when she heard the sirens. She went to her basement with her husband and her elderly mother. The tornado ripped the house off its foundation, but the basement held. They survived. When they emerged, they saw that their house was gone. Every other house on their street was also gone. The neighborhood looked like a giant had taken a broom and swept it clean. As the sun rose on April 28, the full extent of the damage became visible. From the air, the path of the tornado looked like a river of destruction cutting through the green landscape. In Tuscaloosa, the tornado had carved a swath a mile wide through the city. The damage was so complete that in some areas there was nothing recognizable. Even the landmarks were gone. A church that had stood for over 100 years was reduced to a pile of bricks. A high school was so damaged that it had to be rebuilt from scratch. A historic theater was gone. The recovery would take years. FEMA declared the area a federal disaster zone, which allowed for federal funding and assistance. Insurance companies set up mobile claims centers. Charities and churches from all over the country sent supplies and volunteers. The University of Alabama turned its basketball arena into a shelter for displaced families. Students organized donation drives. The outpouring of support was enormous, but the emotional toll was immense. In the weeks and months that followed, there were funerals and memorial services. There were moments of silence. There were flags lowered to half-staff. The community came together, but nothing could replace what had been lost. The names of the victims were read aloud at a memorial service at the Tuscaloosa Amphitheater. There were 64 names, each one a person who had been a parent, a child, a friend, a neighbor. One of the victims was a 21-year-old university student named Ashley McDonald. She was a senior at the University of Alabama. She had been visiting a friend in a house in the Rosedale neighborhood of Tuscaloosa when the tornado struck. The house collapsed, and Ashley was killed. She was just days away from graduation. She would have been the first person in her family to graduate from college. The university awarded her degree posthumously. Her family accepted it at the graduation ceremony. The applause was long and tearful. Another victim was a 75-year-old woman named Evelyn Berry who lived in the Pleasant Grove area. Her son found her body in the ruins of her home 3 days after the storm. She had been trying to get to her basement, but she could not make it in time. Her son said that she had always been afraid of tornadoes. He said that every spring she would watch the sky with a worried look. That April, her worst fear came true. These were the stories that filled the news in the aftermath. But behind each story were thousands of smaller stories, the stories of survivors who would carry the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives. The sound of the wind would never be the same for them. The sight of a dark sky would always trigger a pang of fear. The sirens would make their hearts race. April 27th would forever be a day of remembrance. In the years since the tornado, Tuscaloosa has rebuilt. New homes and businesses have risen from the rubble. The university has built new buildings. The city has planted trees and created parks. There is a memorial in Alberta City to honor the victims, but the scars are still there, hidden in plain sight. In the streets where the tornado passed, there are still empty lots, places where houses once stood, now just grass and weeds. There are still people who cannot talk about that day without tears. The tornado of April 27, 2011 taught Alabamians a hard lesson about nature's power. It brought out the best in people, the kindness, the courage, the selflessness, but it also left a wound that would not heal quickly. This is the story of that day, hour by hour, minute by minute, as it unfolded. This is the story of the Tuscaloosa Birmingham tornado and of the people who lived through it. To truly understand what happened that day, we have to go back to the moments before the tornado touched down. The morning of April 27, 2011 began like any other spring day in Alabama. The air was thick and humid, the sky a hazy white. People went to work and school. Children played outside. The University of Alabama had just finished final exams and students were looking forward to summer. In the Alberta City neighborhood, a man named James Williams was fixing his porch. He had lived there for 30 years. He heard the sirens at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but he thought it was a drill. He went inside and turned on the news. He saw the radar images, a massive hook echo approaching Tuscaloosa. He called his wife at work. She told him to get to the basement. He had no basement, so he grabbed his mattress and a few blankets and went to the bathroom. He turned on the bathtub faucets because he had heard that the sound of running water could help warn you when a tornado is near. He waited. What James did not know was that the tornado that would hit his neighborhood was already on the ground southwest of the city. It had touched down in Greene County, a sparsely populated area of farmland and woods. It was a small tornado at first, just a funnel cloud skimming the treetops. But as it moved northeast, it grew. It sucked up dirt and debris, turning from white to gray to black. By the time it reached the outskirts of Tuscaloosa, it was nearly a mile wide. The National Weather Service in Birmingham had issued a tornado warning at 3:43 in the afternoon. The warning said that a large and extremely dangerous tornado was on the ground. They used words like catastrophic and life-threatening. But even those words could not convey the reality of what was coming. At 4:23, the tornado crossed the Black Warrior River and entered the city. The river was low that day, the water brown and sluggish. The tornado sucked up a plume of water and mud, turning the base of the funnel a sickly brown. It hit the southern edge of the university campus first. The University of Alabama had a state-of-the-art storm shelter system, but not all buildings had them. Students who were in the library or in dormitories were told to take cover, some huddled in hallways, some in bathrooms. The tornado ripped the roof off the Ferguson Center, the student union building. Windows shattered, trees were uprooted. Cars were tossed into the air like toys. Then the tornado moved into the residential neighborhoods. Alberta City took the worst of it. The homes there were mostly older, built in the 1950s and 60s with no basements. Many were wood frame with brick veneers. The tornado hit them like a giant fist. In a matter of seconds, entire blocks were flattened. The tornado threw pieces of wood and metal into the air, turning them into projectiles. A 2x4 could punch a hole through a concrete wall. A piece of roofing tin could slice through a car. The wind was so strong that it stripped the bark off trees, leaving them white and naked. People who survived that part of the tornado described the sound as a freight train, but that was not accurate. It was more like a deep, rumbling roar, like standing next to a waterfall. But it was also filled with the sounds of breaking glass and splintering wood, of metal tearing apart, of screaming. Some said they heard a low-pitched hum like the world itself was vibrating. And then, as suddenly as it started, it was silent. The tornado had passed, but the silence was worse than the roar. It was a dead silence, broken only by the sound of debris falling and the cries of the injured. In the aftermath, the first responders arrived quickly. Firefighters and police officers had been waiting for the storm to pass. They began searching for survivors. They used chainsaws to cut through fallen trees and heavy equipment to move collapsed walls. But they were overwhelmed by the scale of the destruction. They called for help from neighboring counties. The Alabama National Guard was activated. Volunteers arrived with pickups and chainsaws, with shovels and bare hands. They formed bucket brigades, passing pieces of debris from hand to hand, searching for signs of life. One of those volunteers was a man named Robert Ellis, who lived in Northport, just across the river. He had no training, no equipment. He just drove to the nearest area of destruction and started helping. He said later that he found a woman pinned under a refrigerator. He called for help and 4 other men came over. They lifted the refrigerator together and pulled the woman out. Her legs were broken, but she was alive. They carried her to a makeshift triage center set up in a parking lot. There were dozens of other injured people there, lying on blankets and tarps. A retired nurse had appeared from somewhere and was directing the volunteers. Robert said that by the end of the night, he had helped pull 5 people from the rubble. He had also found 2 who were already dead. He did not sleep for 2 days. The hospitals in Tuscaloosa were overwhelmed. The University of Alabama Medical Center, the largest trauma center in West Alabama, received hundreds of patients in the hours after the tornado. The emergency room was so full that doctors treated patients in the hallways, in the cafeteria, even in the chapel. Surgeons performed triage on the lawn outside the hospital. They operated by flashlight when the generator failed. They used whatever supplies they had, running low on blood and IV fluids. They called for help from Birmingham, and a convoy of ambulances and helicopters arrived to transfer the most critical patients. The helicopters landed on the football field of the local high school, which had been turned into a landing zone. At the same time, a different kind of rescue was happening in the neighborhoods. In the Rosedale area, a young father named Michael Thompson had been at work when he heard about the tornado. He tried to call his wife, but the lines were dead. He drove home as fast as he could, but the streets were blocked by debris. He abandoned his car and ran. When he reached his street, he saw that his house was gone. There was nothing left but a concrete slab. He started digging through the pile of lumber and drywall. He found his wife's shoe. He dug faster. A neighbor came to help. They moved a fallen beam and found his wife and their 2-year-old daughter huddled under a mattress. They were alive. They had only minor cuts and bruises. Michael grabbed them and carried them to a neighbor's car, which still worked, and drove them to the hospital. His daughter kept saying, "Daddy, the house went away." Michael said, "It's okay, we'll get a new house." But he knew that nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, the search for the missing continued. The Red Cross set up a family reunification center at the Tuscaloosa Municipal Auditorium. People came there looking for their loved ones, carrying photos and descriptions. The center was staffed by volunteers who tried to match names and faces. There were tearful reunions, but also heartbreaking disappointments. One woman waited for 3 days for news of her husband. She finally learned that his body had been found in the rubble of their home. She collapsed in the arms of a volunteer. The tornado also left a trail of destruction in Birmingham, though the damage was less widespread than in Tuscaloosa. The city of Birmingham, with its larger population and more robust infrastructure, was better equipped to handle the aftermath, but the neighborhoods that were hit, particularly the Pratt City and Pleasant Grove areas, suffered heavy losses. In Pratt City, an entire apartment complex was destroyed. The residents had no warning. The building did not have a tornado siren. The survivors emerged to find that their homes were gone, their cars were gone, their belongings were scattered across the landscape. One woman, a mother of 3, said that she climbed out of the rubble and looked around. She saw a baby doll hanging from a tree. It was her daughter's doll. She picked it up and started crying. That doll was the only thing she had left. The economic impact was staggering. In Tuscaloosa alone, the tornado caused over $2 billion in damage. More than 7,000 homes were destroyed or damaged. Over 100 commercial buildings were flattened. The university sustained over $200 million in damage. The entire city was essentially shut down for a week. Roads were impassable, power was out, water was contaminated. The National Guard set up checkpoints to control access to the affected areas. Looters were a concern, and there were reports of people stealing from destroyed homes, but those were the exceptions. For the most part, the community came together in a remarkable display of solidarity. In the weeks after the tornado, a massive cleanup effort began. The city of Tuscaloosa organized a volunteer network that eventually involved over 20,000 people. They came from all over the state and the country. Church groups, college students, retirees, everyone wanted to help. They sorted donations, served meals, and assisted homeowners with salvage and repair. The University of Alabama opened its doors to displaced students and faculty. The Greek organizations turned their houses into temporary shelters. The football stadium, Bryant-Denny Stadium, became a staging area for supplies. The stories of kindness were as numerous as the stories of loss. A local restaurant owner, whose own building was damaged, opened his kitchen and cooked free meals for volunteers and survivors until his supplies ran out. A group of high school students from a town 2 hours away raised money and drove down with a truckload of bottled water and diapers. A retired construction contractor drove down from Tennessee with a trailer full of tools and offered to help rebuild houses for free. These acts of generosity did not erase the grief, but they provided a lifeline in the darkest of times. The long-term recovery was a slow process. The city of Tuscaloosa established a task force to oversee the rebuilding. They created a master plan that included new building codes, better storm shelters, and green space to serve as buffers in future storms. The federal government provided grants and low-interest loans. Insurance claims were processed, but many people were underinsured, especially those in older homes. Some people simply could not afford to rebuild. They moved away, leaving behind empty lots that became overgrown with weeds. Psychologically, the trauma lingered. A study conducted by psychologists at the University of Alabama found that survivors of the tornado had higher rates of anxiety and depression years after the event. Many reported having nightmares and flashbacks. Some developed a condition known as tornado phobia, an irrational fear of any storm, even a thunderstorm. Children were especially affected. Schools offered counseling services, but the need far exceeded the supply. Yet there were also signs of resilience. The city of Tuscaloosa held an annual remembrance ceremony on April 27th. They lit candles and read the names of the victims. They planted trees in the neighborhoods that had been destroyed. The city built a new park in Alberta City with a memorial wall that listed the names of the 64 victims. It was a place for reflection, a place to honor the lives that were lost. The tornado also changed the way that Alabamians thought about severe weather. The state increased funding for tornado sirens and warning systems. Schools and businesses conducted more frequent drills. The National Weather Service improved its radar technology and forecasting. But no amount of preparation could fully protect against a storm of that magnitude. The Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado was a reminder that nature is unpredictable and that disaster can strike at any moment. As the years passed, many survivors found ways to move forward. Lauren Young, the woman who lost her house in Alberta City, eventually moved with her family to a new home in a different part of town. She said that she still got nervous when the sky turned dark, but she had learned to cope. She kept a weather radio in her bedroom and had a plan. She also talked to her children about the experience to help them process it. She said that the tornado had brought her family closer together. They had survived, and that was what mattered. Micah Brooks, the man who had taken shelter in the laundromat, became a volunteer with the American Red Cross. He helped with disaster response in other parts of the country. He said that he could never forget the sound of the wind, but he could use that experience to help others. He taught classes on tornado safety and told his story to anyone who would listen. Marie Jones, the woman from Birmingham who had lost her house, rebuilt on the same lot. She installed a reinforced safe room in the basement. She said that she wanted to stay in the neighborhood because it was home. She worked with other survivors to establish a neighborhood association that focused on disaster preparedness. They held meetings, organized drills, and built a community emergency kit. The University of Alabama also rebuilt. The Ferguson Center was renovated and expanded. New student housing was constructed with built-in storm shelters. The university established a scholarship fund in memory of the students who were killed. The fund provided financial assistance to students from areas affected by natural disasters. In the broader context, the April 27 tornado outbreak led to changes at the national level. The federal government increased funding for tornado research and early warning systems. The National Weather Service implemented a new system for issuing severe weather alerts, including the use of emergency alerts on cell phones. The outbreak also sparked a national conversation about climate change and whether it was contributing to more extreme weather events. Scientists were cautious, but they noted that the conditions that led to the outbreak, an unusually warm Gulf of Mexico, a strong jet stream, and high levels of moisture were consistent with a warming climate. But for the people of Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, the science was secondary. What mattered most was the human toll, the lives that were lost and the lives that were changed forever. The tornado of April 27, 2011 was not just a natural disaster. It was a personal catastrophe for every family that was touched by it. It was a day that would be remembered for generations, a day that would be passed down through stories and photographs and scars. The storm itself was a product of nature, a violent twist of wind that defied comprehension, but the response to the storm was a testament to the human spirit. In the face of destruction, people reached out to one another. They overcame grief and exhaustion. They rebuilt their homes, their neighborhoods, and their lives. They did not do it quickly or easily, but they did it. And that is perhaps the most remarkable part of this story, not the destruction but the recovery. The tornado took everything from some people, but it could not take away their will to survive, their capacity for kindness, or their hope for a better tomorrow. In the end, the Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado was a tragedy, but it was also a story of courage, of community, of resilience. It was a story that would be told for years to come in classrooms, at dinner tables, and in the pages of history books. And it was a story that would never truly end, because the people who lived through it would carry it with them forever. The tornado was a scar on the landscape, but the people who survived it were the ones who would heal. As the sun rose on the morning after the storm, the citizens of Tuscaloosa and Birmingham began the long work of putting their lives back together. They did not know how long it would take, but they knew they would do it together. They dug through the rubble, they comforted the grieving, they celebrated the survivors, they found grace in the midst of chaos. They found strength in the face of loss. And they discovered that even in the darkest of times there is light. That light was the human spirit, and it shone brightly in the days and weeks after the tornado. It still shines today in the memories of those who lived through it, in the new buildings that have risen from the ruins, and in the hearts of a community that refused to be broken. But that light did not burn steadily from the beginning. In the first few weeks, it flickered and wavered under the weight of grief and exhaustion. There were days when even the most optimistic survivors felt that the darkness would never lift. For every story of a family reuniting, there was a story of a family torn apart. For every act of kindness, there was a moment of despair. The cleanup crews worked 16-hour days, their faces masks of grim determination, their hands blistered and raw. Volunteers came from all over the country, but they also left after a week or two, and the enormity of the work remained. One of the most difficult tasks was identifying the dead. The coroner's office set up a temporary morgue at a local community college. Forensic teams worked around the clock, using dental records, fingerprints, and DNA samples. In some cases, there was nothing left but fragments of clothing or personal belongings. Families waited for hours, sometimes days, for news. They sat in cars outside the morgue praying for a miracle. When identification was made, the news was delivered in person by a chaplain or a victim advocate. It was a process that left deep emotional scars on everyone involved. In the months after the tornado, the city of Tuscaloosa became a laboratory for disaster recovery. Urban planners from across the country came to study what had happened and to advise on rebuilding. The city council held public meetings where survivors could voice their opinions. Some wanted to rebuild exactly as before to restore a sense of normalcy. Others argued for a complete redesign, with wider streets, better drainage, and designated green spaces that could serve as natural buffers. There were heated debates about zoning laws, about the placement of mobile home parks, about whether to allow rebuilding in the most heavily damaged areas. The Alberta City neighborhood, which had been ground zero for the tornado's fury, became a focal point of these discussions. Entire blocks had been erased. The only landmarks that remained were the foundations of houses and the twisted remains of trees. A group of residents formed the Alberta City Community Association and began meeting weekly. They wanted a say in what their neighborhood would become. They pushed for affordable housing, for a community center, for parks and playgrounds. They did not want their neighborhood to become a ghost town or a development of upscale apartments that priced out the original residents. The city's master plan eventually incorporated many of these ideas. New building codes required that all new homes have reinforced storm shelters or safe rooms. The concept of a tornado-safe house emerged, with concrete walls, steel roofs, and impact-resistant windows. Some architects designed homes that could withstand winds of up to 200 miles per hour. These houses were more expensive to build, but the city offered tax incentives and grants to make them accessible to low-income families. The tornado also changed the way that schools approach safety. In the years before the storm, many Alabama schools did not have a standard protocol for tornado warnings. Some sent students home early, which could be dangerous if the storm arrived unexpectedly. Others had them huddle in hallways, but those hallways were often filled with windows. After the outbreak, the state mandated that all schools conduct at least 2 tornado drills per year. They also required that every school have a designated safe area, ideally a basement or an interior room without windows. Many schools built new safe rooms that could hold the entire student body. In Birmingham, the recovery was complicated by the fact that the damage was spread across multiple neighborhoods. Pratt City, for example, was a close-knit community of working-class families. The tornado had destroyed the local library, the fire station, and several churches. The library had been a gathering place for children and seniors, and its loss was deeply felt. A community group called Pratt City Revitalization was formed to coordinate recovery efforts. They organized block parties and cookouts to lift spirits. They also lobbied the city to speed up the process of clearing debris and repairing roads. One of the most inspiring stories to come out of Birmingham was that of a woman named Gloria Jackson. She was a nurse who had been working at a hospital on the day of the storm. After her shift ended, she drove home to find that her house was gone. Her husband and 2 children had survived by hiding in the bathtub, but they had lost everything. Gloria did not break down. Instead, she went to the Red Cross shelter and started helping. She worked there for 3 days straight without sleep, triaging the injured, comforting the terrified, and organizing supplies. Later, when asked how she found the strength, she said that she had to keep moving. If she stopped, she would have collapsed. Gloria eventually rebuilt her house, but she also became a volunteer coordinator for a nonprofit that focused on long-term disaster recovery. She helped other families navigate the insurance claims process, find temporary housing, and apply for federal assistance. She said that the experience had taught her that the real recovery did not begin until months after the news cameras had left. That was when the isolation set in, when the donations dried up, when the survivors were left to face the empty lots and the haunting memories. The psychological toll continued to manifest in unexpected ways. Some survivors developed a condition known as survivor's guilt. They wondered why they had lived while their neighbors had died. They questioned whether they could have done more, whether they could have warned someone, whether they should have insisted that a friend or family member take shelter. These thoughts could be paralyzing. A man named Robert, who had been at work when the tornado hit, could not bring himself to return to his job at a warehouse. He had seen the destruction from a distance and had driven through the rubble to find his wife. She was safe, but he could not shake the image of the bodies he had seen along the way. He started drinking heavily and stopped sleeping. His wife finally convinced him to see a counselor, but the road to recovery was long. Children were especially vulnerable. In the weeks after the storm, pediatricians reported a spike in anxiety-related illnesses. Children refused to go outside when the sky was cloudy. They had nightmares about spinning winds. Some regressed to behaviors like bedwetting or thumb-sucking. Schools implemented art therapy programs, where children could draw pictures of the tornado and talk about their feelings. One elementary school teacher in Tuscaloosa used a sandbox and toy figures to help her students reenact what had happened. It was a way for them to process the trauma in a safe environment. The University of Alabama Psychology Department conducted a study that followed a group of survivors for 5 years. The results showed that those who had strong social support networks recovered faster. People who were part of a church, a neighborhood association, or even a regular card club were less likely to develop severe PTSD. The researchers also found that the act of helping others was therapeutic. Survivors who volunteered for disaster relief, who helped rebuild houses or deliver meals, reported lower levels of depression. It seemed that the best medicine was purpose, and so the community found purpose in the rebuilding. In Tuscaloosa, a group of homeowners started a neighborhood watch program that doubled as a disaster response team. They stored generators, chainsaws, and first aid kits in a communal shed. They created a phone tree to check on elderly neighbors during storms. They practiced their emergency plan once a month. This sense of preparedness gave them a sense of control, a way to push back against the helplessness that the tornado had inflicted. In Birmingham, a coalition of churches formed a recovery network that lasted for years. They not only provided financial assistance but also emotional and spiritual support. Pastors trained in crisis counseling visited families in their temporary homes. They held prayer vigils on the anniversaries of the storm. They created a fund that paid for mental health counseling for anyone who needed it, regardless of insurance. One pastor, Reverend Thomas, said that his congregation had learned that God was present not in the storm but in the response to the storm. He quoted a line from Scripture, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." For many, that joy came slowly, but it came. The economic impact of the tornado was felt for years. Small businesses that had been destroyed often could not reopen. The owners had lost their inventory, their equipment, their customer base. Some were underinsured and could not afford to rebuild. The city of Tuscaloosa created a small business recovery fund, but it was not enough to save everyone. Some of the businesses that did reopen moved to different locations, which changed the character of the neighborhoods. A hardware store that had been on a corner for 40 years became a parking lot. A family-run diner that served the best fried chicken in town was replaced by a chain restaurant, but new businesses also emerged. A group of entrepreneurs opened a microbrewery in the heart of downtown Tuscaloosa. They used reclaimed wood from the destroyed homes to build the bar and tables. They named their signature beer, Twister IPA, and donated a portion of the proceeds to tornado relief. Another survivor started a landscaping company that specialized in planting trees that were resistant to high winds. He used the knowledge he had gained from the storm to educate homeowners about how to protect their properties. The University of Alabama, which had suffered millions of dollars in damage, used the opportunity to modernize its campus. The Ferguson Center was rebuilt with a state-of-the-art storm shelter that could hold 2,000 people. The new student housing complexes included safe rooms on every floor. The university also established a center for disaster research, which attracted scholars from around the world. They studied everything from the social dynamics of evacuation to the engineering of storm-resistant structures. The tornado had given them a real-world laboratory, but the price was high. On the 10th anniversary of the storm, in 2021, the city of Tuscaloosa held a special commemoration. The event was held at the new park in Alberta City, the one with the memorial wall. Survivors came from across the country. They gathered at midday, the exact time when the tornado had touched down a decade earlier. The mayor read a proclamation, a choir sang. The names of the 64 victims were read aloud, each followed by the ringing of a bell. There were tears, but there was also laughter. People hugged, shared stories, and took pictures. Some visited the empty lots where their homes had once stood. They pointed to where the kitchen had been, where their children's bedroom had been, where they had huddled in the hallway. Micah Brooks was there. He had driven from his home in Florida, where he now worked as a full-time disaster response coordinator. He walked through the park and remembered the laundromat that had saved his life. The building was gone now, replaced by a row of townhouses, but he could still hear the sound of the wind in his ears. He touched the memorial wall and ran his fingers over the names. He said a silent prayer for each one. Lauren Young also attended, now a grandmother. She lived in a new house in the same neighborhood, a house with a reinforced safe room. She had taught her grandchildren the tornado drill. Go to the safe room, grab the weather radio, bring the dog. She said that the fear never completely went away, but she had learned to live with it. She told a reporter that the tornado had taken her home, but it had not taken her spirit. The memorial wall itself was a simple structure, a curved wall of black granite about 6 feet high. The names were engraved in a spiral pattern, symbolizing the tornado's path. At the base of the wall, there was a single line, "We will remember." And the community did remember. Every April 27th, the sirens tested at 1:30 in the afternoon, the time the tornado had entered the city. People paused, bowed their heads, and remembered. The tornado also left a mark on the national consciousness. The 2011 outbreak was a turning point in the history of severe weather awareness. The term tornado outbreak became common in daily speech. The National Weather Service changed its warning systems to include more specific language, such as "This is a particularly dangerous situation." The use of mobile phone alerts became standard. Many people who had never thought about tornado safety began to pay attention. The outbreak also prompted a nationwide discussion about the adequacy of building codes in tornado-prone areas. Some communities adopted stricter standards, though the cost remained a barrier. In the years that followed, scientists continued to study the supercell that had produced the Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado. They used computer models to simulate its development, trying to understand why it had been so powerful. They found that the combination of environmental factors, high instability, strong wind shear, and a lifting mechanism from a dryline created the perfect conditions for a violent tornado. They also noted that the storm had been remarkably long-lived, maintaining its intensity for over an hour. There were still mysteries about why some storms become tornadoes and others do not. The research continued, but for the people who lived through it, the science was just a backdrop. The real story was about survival. It was about the man who lost his wife but saved his daughter. It was about the woman who gave birth in a shelter while the wind roared overhead. It was about the volunteers who came from hundreds of miles away, who had never seen Alabama before, who worked until their bodies gave out. It was about the children who had nightmares and the teachers who held them. It was about the faith that carried people through the darkest hours. The Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado of 2011 was not the deadliest in American history nor the biggest, but it was one of the most devastating in terms of its path of extreme violence through densely populated areas. It was a storm that shattered records and lives, and yet from the rubble a new community emerged. It was not the same as before, but it was still strong. The people had learned to anticipate the storms, to prepare for them, to support each other when they came. They had built a culture of resilience that would be passed down to future generations. As the years pass, the stories become legends. The children who were born after the storm will never know what it was like to see the sky turn green, to hear the freight train roar, to dig through the debris for a lost loved one. But they will hear the stories from their parents and grandparents. They will see the scars on the landscape, the new houses built on old foundations. They will walk through the memorial park and read the names. And they will understand that the tornado was not just a day of destruction but a day of revelation. It revealed the fragility of life and the depth of love. It revealed the power of nature and the power of community, and in that revelation there was a kind of grace. So we end where we began, with the wind, but the wind is no longer a menace. It is a reminder. It whispers through the trees that have grown back, through the flags that fly at half-mast, through the prayers that rise from the memorial wall. It carries the memories of those who were lost and the hopes of those who survived. And if you listen closely, you can hear a refrain, a quiet and steady promise, that even in the most violent storm there is a calm at the center. That calm is the human heart. That calm is the reason we rebuild. That calm is the light that never goes out. And yet the story does not end there. For every survivor, the tornado remains a living memory, one that continues to shape their choices and their understanding of the world. In the years after the memorial, new generations grew up in a city that had been reshaped by catastrophe and renewal. Children born in 2012 or 2013 would ask their parents why the trees in certain neighborhoods were so small, why some streets had no old houses. Parents would explain, sometimes through tears, sometimes with a matter-of-fact tone that spoke of healing. They would say that a big wind had come and changed everything. And the children would nod, not fully understanding, but sensing that this was a story that mattered. One of those children was a girl named Maya, born in Tuscaloosa on the 4th of July, 2012. Her mother had been 8 months pregnant when the tornado hit and had sheltered in a friend's basement while the world shook. Maya grew up hearing that story as a kind of origin myth. Her mother would say that the storm had taught her what mattered most, that Maya was a gift born from the wreckage. Maya herself never saw the tornado, but she felt its shadow. When the spring storms came, her family would gather in the closet with the emergency kit and the battery-powered radio. Her mother's hands would tremble, but her voice stayed steady. Maya learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. In high school, Maya chose to write her senior thesis on the tornado. She interviewed survivors, collected photographs, and visited the memorial wall. She discovered that the story was not just about destruction, but about the people who had rebuilt. She wrote about the laundromat that had saved Micah Brooks and about Lauren Young's new house with the reinforced safe room. She learned that the tornado had been a catalyst for change, forcing the city to confront its vulnerabilities. The thesis won a prize, and Maya was invited to speak at a conference on disaster resilience. She stood at the podium, a young woman who had never heard the roar of an EF4, and she spoke about how memory becomes a kind of architecture supporting the future. The conference was held in Birmingham at a hotel that had been built on the site of a destroyed elementary school. The hotel's design included a storm shelter in the basement, with concrete walls and steel doors. Maya's audience included engineers, emergency managers, and survivors. She told them that the tornado had taught her generation something invaluable, that preparation is an act of love. She said that when her mother taught her the tornado drill, she was not just teaching safety, she was teaching that life is precious and that we have a duty to protect each other. The room was silent, and then they applauded. In that moment, Maya understood that the storm had not only taken lives, it had also given a voice to the next generation. Meanwhile, the scientific community continued to make strides. The Center for Disaster Research at the University of Alabama became a hub for innovation. One of its most significant contributions was the development of a new mobile weather radar system that could be deployed rapidly in the path of a developing supercell. This radar could scan the entire depth of a storm in seconds, providing real-time data on rotation and debris signatures. Meteorologists began to issue warnings with lead times that would have been unimaginable in 2011. The average warning time increased from 13 minutes to nearly 25. That extra 12 minutes could mean the difference between life and death. But technology alone was not enough. The social fabric of communities had to be strengthened as well. Tuscaloosa launched a neighborhood preparedness program that trained residents in basic first aid, search and rescue, and communication protocols. Every block had a designated captain who knew which neighbors had disabilities, which had generators, which had medical training. The program was modeled on the informal networks that had emerged during the immediate aftermath of the tornado, the chains of volunteers who had worked side by side without waiting for official orders. The city recognized that the most effective first responders are often the people who live next door. There were also changes on a national level. The National Weather Service introduced a new category of warning called a tornado emergency, reserved for situations where a violent tornado was confirmed and expected to cause catastrophic damage. The first such warning had been issued for the Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado, but now the protocol was formalized. Broadcasters adopted a standard script, and cell phones received a special alert tone that could not be silenced. The goal was to get people to act immediately, not to wait for confirmation. It was a lesson written in blood. In Alabama, the state legislature passed a law requiring all new public schools to include storm shelters in their construction plans. The law was named after a young boy who had died in the tornado while sheltering in a school that had no reinforced area. The boy's mother testified before the legislature, her voice steady but her eyes wet. She said that her son had loved to draw tornadoes, that he had been fascinated by storms. She said that if his death could save other children, then he would not have died in vain. The bill passed unanimously. The law was not the only legacy of the boy's story. His mother started a foundation that provided weather radios to low-income families. She traveled to schools across the state, teaching children about tornado safety. She showed them how to identify safe spots in their homes, how to recognize the signs of impending danger. She always carried a photograph of her son, a smiling boy with a gap-toothed grin. She would hold it up and say, "This is why we prepare, because every child deserves a chance to grow up." The foundation distributed more than 10,000 radios in the first 5 years. Back in Tuscaloosa, the city continued to evolve. The Alberta City neighborhood that had been reduced to rubble was now a model of resilient design. The streets were wider to allow emergency vehicles to pass. The new homes were built with hurricane straps and impact-resistant windows. There were green spaces that doubled as stormwater retention areas, reducing the risk of flooding during heavy rains. The community center was equipped with a backup generator and a satellite communication system. The playground was shaded by trees that had been selected for their ability to withstand high winds. It was a neighborhood that had been rebuilt not just to survive a storm but to thrive in the face of any adversity, and the people remembered. Every April 27th, the sirens still tested at 1:30 in the afternoon. The memorial wall in Alberta City became a pilgrimage site. Visitors left flowers, notes, and small tokens. Sometimes a survivor would sit on the bench nearby and watch the names glint in the afternoon light. They would trace the spiral pattern with their fingers, following the path of destruction that had become a path of remembrance. They would think of loved ones lost and of strangers saved. They would think of the days of chaos and the months of rebuilding. And they would feel a sadness that never fully faded, but also a gratitude that grew stronger with each passing year. The tornado of 2011 was not just a moment in history. It was a fracture that revealed the inner strength of a community. It was a teacher that demanded attention and obedience. It was a darkness that forced people to find the light within themselves. And that light did not go out. It was passed from parent to child, from neighbor to neighbor, from survivor to stranger. It burned in the hearts of those who had lived through the storm and those who had only heard the stories. It burned in the rebuilt schools and the new parks and the quiet homes with their safe rooms. It burned in the sirens that sang their mournful song every spring. It burned in the memory of the 64 names, each one a life that had mattered. So we do not end with the wind, we end with the people who faced it and who continue to face it year after year. They are the ones who have learned that the calm at the center of the storm is not just a physical space but a choice. They have chosen to be that calm, they have chosen to rebuild, they have chosen to remember. And as long as they do, the storm will never have the last word. The last word belongs to them, to their courage, to their love. That is the story of Tuscaloosa. That is the story of Birmingham. That is the story of a people who looked into the face of the most violent thing on earth and refused to look away. They held each other's hands, they dug through the rubble, they built new homes, they raised new children, they kept the faith, and they kept going. The wind may still howl. The sky may still turn green, the sirens may still sound, but the people are ready. They have been forged in the fire of an EF4. They know what it means to lose everything and to find everything worth holding onto. They know that in the end, it is not the storm that defines them. It is how they respond. It is the kindness they show. It is the strength they share. It is the light they carry even in the darkest hour. And that light never goes out. It never will.